Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for participating in the science on the screen, if that's what it was, on screen. It's great. It's something that is typical of the Salina Art Center to integrate community conversations and go outside of a narrow definition of art and see how it connects to the rest of the world. And certainly these two films caused us to have a lot of conversations, Sarah and me. And I hope that you all are ready to have a conversation, because I'm certainly not going to just sit up here and talk. Being the invited discussion leader, however, I will take the opportunity to make a couple of opening comments. I'm curious how many people had seen Soylent Green back in, what, 73? Is that, okay. And then how many? Yeah, right. That's about what I saw too. And how many did see At the Fork? Quite a few. Okay. Well, Soylent Green was better than I expected it to be, actually, after all this time. After seeing Twister on a previous event, that was, well, maybe not quite as intriguing as Soylent Green was in terms of a thought experiment and just a dystopian portrayal of kind of seemingly where we're headed in the distant year of 2022, which just also was remarkable to see that and know that when we first saw that date, it was, well, the movie was kind of feasible, right? And in fact, the movie followed Paul Ehrlich's publication of The Population Bomb by just a few years. And that book, coupled with a handful of other kind of Malthusian-inspired projections of where society was headed, definitely portrayed a super overshoot in terms of population, as the movie portrayed, and the scarcity of all sorts of critical minerals and fossil fuels and things like this. I'm sure that everyone else was, kind of taken back at mentioning climate change in the movie also as being really central to why they didn't have food. It was too hot to grow, and the conditions were no longer viable to produce abundant amounts of food, and so they're having to resort to these, mass-produced chips. And for those of us tracking even back then the climate change discussion, there was global cooling around that time also as one viable hypothesis that was put out there, and global warming was definitely not mainstream at that time, but nevertheless, it was fully integrated into the movie, so that was intriguing. I guess I would just like to suggest that the movie is still not that far-fetched. and when Paul Ehrlich is interviewed about how outlandish some of the claims or speculations they made in The Population Bomb were, he also will come back and say, well, obviously we had some things didn't turn out the way we've predicted, but the basic overshoot of society in terms of living within what Johan Rockström, who is a ecosystem ecologist in Sweden, calls the safe operating zone for humanity. And this was first launched in a paper in 2009 in Nature, and it's been revised since then. But in the world of ecology, Rockström has framed a bunch of different areas in terms of us living in the ecosphere this term that Wes Jackson is promoting a lot, and goes beyond just biology, but rather thinking about ourselves on a planet that is the ecosphere. And what I mean by that, and what Rockstrom in Safe Operating Spaces means, is that we're overshooting the planet's capacity to regenerate the very basic life-providing things we depend on, like water and clean air and food and a safe temperature and things like this. So on the list of safe operating spaces in Rockstrom's papers is climate change. So that's one area where we have already overshot and we need to get back. Rate of biodiversity loss. The nitrogen cycle, something I'm very interested and involved in. We're all involved in it, but I pay attention more than most. And how we've overshot the nitrogen cycle in terms of the planet's ability to function coherently as it has over evolutionary time. The phosphorus cycle, something even fewer people think about, but also we all depend on. Stratospheric ozone depletion, ocean acidification, global freshwater use, change in land use, the conversion of natural ecosystems to cropland, atmospheric aerosol loading, and finally chemical pollution is the list of areas that this group in Sweden is trying to keep track of individually to assess where humanity stands in the ability of the planet to maintain viable systems for us to live in. Not to mention every other species, right? So Soylent Green to me was a kind of it was just, what Charleston has done. I mean, there were some crazy things about it, but the portrayal of too many people living at a very substandard existence does not seem to be outside of the realm of possibility at all in the next 50 years, 10, 50, 100 years, who knows when. But based on what we know to be the planet's ability to sustain life, we are living in borrowed time, particularly with respect to our dependence on fossil fuels, which I'm happy to talk about because fossil fuels makes it all possible in agriculture and so many other aspects of our lives. So those are just a couple of comments about Soylent Green. I wonder if we want to structure the discussion to focus a little bit on Soylent Green. There are some, I have actually tried to connect the two a little bit, and I'd be curious if anyone else saw some relationships between the two movies. Not obvious, but intriguing. But why don't we open it up a little bit just to comment on Soylent Green and thoughts, impressions?
Specifically on Soylent Green.
Yeah, for the moment, and then we'll move into the next film in a second, if there are any.
I was talking to Bill about that movie yesterday, and we both agree, I mean, as an artist and art administrator, it looked like it was made in my backyard. I mean, it's just really crappy production.
Yeah.
And of course, I felt a murmur of disgust when Charlton Heston's name was mentioned. I'm on that side too. But yeah, I'm with you, Kim. I just perfectly reasonable. I mean, it's a logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that really bother me, and it must be the imperial upbringing. Because Stephen Hawking the other day, I read where he said, we've got to find another planet. He's been saying this for a while. Earth has become too small for us. Wait a minute. Isn't that kind of a reversal of reality? I mean, it's a big ball. And we've just become too big for it.
Our britches, so to speak, right?
Well, I've been thinking we're the only species that I know of that has overpopulation. globally.
Yeah.
And there's other, you know, there's starlings over here, fire ants over there, but globally, it's us.
Yeah.
I want to just say, coming back to the movie specifically about that, cinematically, yes, maybe you're right, the production, it could be your backyard, but.
Speak up.
The the contrast between that bleak, washed out atmosphere throughout the movie, and then the wonderful glowing pictures of roses and sunsets and so forth, and the last really is that contrast, because that's what they're offering him, is this paradise, 20 minutes of paradise. I guess it isn't 76 virgins or 70, whatever, 72, whatever. But that's what they live for, is that last 20 minutes of this beautiful earth that once was.
Well, you know, you can go to the Lower East Side, New York, and who in this room wants to live like that? They don't know what they call a tree is.
Yeah.
Well, for that matter, those cattle in the livestock feedlots, whose life is not worth living, as Lisa says.
Yeah.
I hate to monopolize this, but there's one of those reality shows that I loathe most of them. But my brother turned me on to this one called Fat Guys in the Woods. Has anybody seen it?
We're not in a rarefied atmosphere.
I recommend it. And a former student and friend, Sherry Nichols, is in Kentucky or someplace like that. She said, "Oh, I love that series." Well, it's this outdoorsman who knows what the hell he's doing. He take these three fat guys out to the woods. They live together for a day or two. They build a shelter, and after they're given a liter of water, at the end of which time they've got to find their own water, they've got to build their own shelter, and they've got to find their own food. Well, this one episode, they discovered an animal trail, and there's something big on it, and it's down in a deep ravine. And they keep checking back, and there's a wild boar. Well, those are mean guys, and so this guy led them to build certain things, and three of them crawled down in this thing to corner this boar. They caught him, and the leader gave the guy a knife, a huge knife. They told him where to stab him, and he did, and the guy lost a heap of pride. He'd never done anything like that. And the leader said, "Look, you've all had ham, you've all enjoyed bacon. This pig lived a better life and died a more dignified death than what you've been eating." And that's real power.
Other comments?
The link has been made between the two movies already.
Yes. Yes, they have. Well, we
That was
must.
quick.
Yeah.
I guess when I was watching the film, I was able to watch the Soylent Green actually on Amazon Prime. I looked at the date, as you said, it was released in '73, and population bomb in '68, and the limits of growth in '72 by the Club of Rome, and I said to myself, well, what's happened since then? What can you easily access? So I did Ehrlich's name, and I came across what they called a retro report in the New York Times Online in 2015, and was titled "The Unrealized Horrors of the Population Explosion." Times doesn't do all the time, but in this case they did a video interviewing food security experts, and what struck me as interesting was a lot of reference back to these predictions, and they had one of the experts was from India. She was describing how Ehrlich got this idea because he was a butterfly ecologist, and he was in India sometime, I guess, in the early '60s, and he had never been in an environment with dense populations, and it just struck him. He wasn't a population ecologist I guess at that point in his career, his academic career, it just struck him that if what he saw in India was extended to the whole world, it would be like Soylent Green, I guess.
Right.
And so what she pointed out was that India did some awful things that got into mandatory sterilization, and they did a lot of awful things. But she said in the end, it was the Green Revolution that transformed India from being this basket case to being, I guess, a breadbasket. And so that it just struck me that first of all it was an interesting article to view, and then also to read a little, the supporting information. But it just struck me that that there's all these reassessments. When will they end? When will we get to a point where we say that our trajectory is not 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years? It may be 1,000 years, 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And also it gets back to this idea about science communication. That people who work seeing as an alarmist and who talk about catastrophe, and then it doesn't happen.
Right.
You lose credibility. How do you communicate that idea that there may be a likely event that we're going to be in dire straits, but how do you communicate the fact that it's just a probability. It's one scenario that may not pan out, and so therefore not to be locked into this forecast that causes people to not trust you.
Yeah.
Well, so Jerry, I want to say I appreciate you doing that research. And it's interesting, the Green Revolution, of course, is based on fossil fuels, on nitrogen fertilizers and so on. So that did postpone the inevitable, but rather than being a bridge to the future, it also was an ever longer plank off the pirate ship that we'll be able to walk to, because that abrupt end is still out there, but we don't know we're on that plank because we still have fossil fuels, we're still expending them, and they're still contributing to our eventual demise. So what you say is true. We extend out into the future. We don't know when that's going to hit, but the effect of it will be much more catastrophic when it finally does.
That's one theory. I think that the Green Revolution, as much as it was based on fossil fuels and energy, it was based on genetics.
Well, let's pull those together, because it was both, and it required both to work. The genetics were to redefine the architecture of wheat, in particular with respect to India, and make what they call the harvest index, this part that you harvest, much larger on the plant, which is something we're trying to do with perennial species right now at the Land Institute. But when you have a much larger seed production on a plant, seed contains a lot of protein, which though is made of amino acids that contain a lot of nitrogen. And all of a sudden, in order to support that increased productivity of the Green Revolution, it became essential to use copious amounts of synthetic nitrogen, which is the most energy expensive input into modern agriculture. Okay, it blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. People have been pulled off airplanes because of ammonium nitrate on their shoes. It has a lot of embodied energy, and all that embodied energy came from typically natural gas. In China, they use coal. But it is one of our most profound links in terms of our food to fossil fuels. We don't eat fossil fuels directly, but Vaclav Smil, the Canadian geographer, has said that about 40%, I think more like 50 now, because he said this in 1990, 50% of humanity owes its existence to nitrogen fertilizer. He claims it's the most significant existential invention of humanity in the 20th century. And by that he means more people would not exist if we hadn't invented synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So as we push 9.8 billion people by 2050, which is what the report last week that came out suggested, you know, it's arguable that about 4 to 5 billion of them may owe their existence to nitrogen fertilizer.
Well, that's probably what trash Malthus theory.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Your pesticides, you know.
Right.
It did grow more than arithmetically.
And I think this is the point, although we are hitting a limit, again, we haven't had and can't foresee anything like the Green Revolution happening. Now there's some pretty out there ideas in terms of raising food synthetically entirely, growing meat on tissue cultures. That we should say, well, we might as well just move right into the next film, I suspect. We're on the way. I do want to say, tie this conversation of nitrogen with the At the Fork film, because I found it to be a fantastic portrayal of some of the complexity around, you know, the omnivore's dilemma, as Michael Pollan calls it. What should we be eating? At what price? And yet, the movie was predominantly in the animal, kind of humane treatment of animals realm, which is perfectly fine, but it did not delve, for example, into the broader ecosystem impacts of raising meat so much. The whole problem of confining animals to this space means you have to ship tons of grain to where those 12,000 to 80,000 pig farm populations are, and then the manure is concentrated there beyond belief in a way that you never ever have concentrations of nutrients like that occurring in a natural ecosystem. And then, but to transport those nutrients back to Illinois, where maybe some of the grain shipments came from, or to Kansas or wherever they came from, is prohibitively expensive. And so you end up having very problematic concentrations of nutrients in the regions where you raise animals, confinement animal operations, everything from Chesapeake Bay to the Arkansas River Valley in Oklahoma. I mean, it is a huge problem. And the degree to which humanity is verging on growing more of its meat this way creates just catastrophic water quality issues, not to mention greenhouse gases that come off, methane and nitrous oxide come off feedlot landscapes, because again, there's just too much nitrogen there. So it's another reason why having animals out on a perennial pasture, eating and pooping in a ratio that makes perfectly good sense for that ecosystem is as important. It's just another layer of rationale as to why that system of confinement animal husbandry is extremely problematic.
Tim, I think also that probably capitalism is one of the culprits also. I mean, my father-in-law was sort of a farmer. He had cattle and he loved them, you know, and he respected them. And I found it real sad when the farmers started believing bullshit of more production and you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And I haven't finished watching the film, but there's farmers around that know how to make it without that stuff. And because they're paying attention to what nature has done. And you know, well, I'm reading about some of the Antarctic explorers, and they had the same attitude that we can overcome anything. Scott proved them wrong. You know, you can. But we still have that, and that's why I think it's kind of an imperialist attitude get from the Brits. And the only society that makes sense to me is the primitive societies, you know, and they're the ones that want to keep the oil in the ground today. We're just following the wrong leaders.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, not being a scientist and probably totally naive in this regard. Two things. I just feel an immense pressure on agriculture because of our unreasonable demands for food and what we want to have on our tables. And I don't think on the bucolic farm with 1 cow per acre or whatever can't meet the demand with that kind of approach to farming. Also, the CAFO operations, they do a kind of artificial feeding, it seems to me, in order to boost weight and growth by a tremendous factor in a very short period of time so they can get these animals to market. So at some point we've got to have more public education than we have now about diet. And I mean, we're all, this is the choir here, you know, we don't need that. My other question is there some empirical study that relates availability of good pasture to the numbers of animals we can feed on it if we wanted to spread things out in a way that isn't so harmful to land use? And I don't know the answer to that. There are certainly places where we don't have a lot of rolling pasture land like we have here. And I'm thinking globally, not just in the American Midwest.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, did you?
I was just gonna say we can eat less meat, right? Like, if people ate less meat, you wouldn't have to produce as much.
Yeah, here's a paper by John Foley, who's now at the California Academy of Sciences, and but the author list is a lot of the heavy hitters, including the guy I just mentioned, Rockstrom. Solutions for a cultivated planet, and it offers 5 suggestions for what humanity must do to have enough food and to leave enough nature available for other species if we're going to have any hope, is what the thesis of this is. And the 5 simple points that they make are that we need to stop expanding the footprint of agriculture into other less productive, because we're already farming the most productive lands, so anything we expand into is lower productivity, more marginal lands, and it's where the rest of nature is living. And so stop the footprint expansion of agriculture, increase the food produced per hectare or per area of land, but without inputs, without more purchased inputs. So and we call this ecological intensification as opposed to input intensification, which is what the Green Revolution was about, pesticides, fertilizers. The proposal here is to have an agriculture that actually does a lot more of what needs to be done because of the plants and the microbes and everything that are involved to make a very productive ecosystem, more productive even than we're doing with the inputs, is what they're promoting. And then the others are reducing meat consumption, and there's absolute universal agreement that has to happen. At least with the folks who are eating 200% of their protein requirements in meat. We could easily bring it down to 40% from animal products, have plenty of animal in our diet if you like that. And if we did that in the US, some of us have worked on some statistics that would show we would not need nitrogen fertilizers in the US. You could take land out of grain production, put it into legumes, have a rotation, and produce all of the food in the US without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, even though we use more of it per capita than any other country in the world right now. So it's an interesting relationship with meat and animal products. And the fifth thing, which Barb was talking about after the movie, is reducing food waste. The number that people talk about a lot, at least in the US, is that we throw out 40% of our food. You know, so for every one plate of food we eat, we throw out 4/5 of a plate over here. And while Barb pointed out, apparently the statistics suggest that we don't throw out as much meat, maybe half as much. The reality is the footprint behind that meat is 10 times the footprint as the vegetable matter you're throwing out. So in reality, if you're throwing out 20% of the meat, you're actually throwing out a heck of a lot of food because it took so much grain to make that meat. So quite simply, you're absolutely right that a 1 hectare per animal or 1 acre per animal, that's kind of a stocking rate that you might have further in the West. But you aren't going to have the meat production that we have come to demand at a very, as was suggested in the movie, at a low cost. And it is this education you're talking about, it is this setting where we could possibly start to demand higher quality meat, just like the movie talked about. Less of it, you know, Michael Pollan's eat food, not too much, mostly plants, is a pretty good rule of thumb. Yeah.
I think I read a similar article by Foley, wrote it in 2010 or 11, 5 points. The fourth one that you didn't mention, the one of raising the yield ceiling was important, but in their opinion, the fourth one was that there's such a disparity between the developed world and the developing world as far as yield, and when we try to transfer our know-how to Africa, whatever, it hasn't fit very well. Right. As David said about they just don't have the access to all those inputs. Right. But in there they said that when the population reaches 9 billion in 2050, that doubling the food supply of the planet will rely on that fourth concept of figuring out a way to get these extremely low-yielding lands that are not low-yielding because of their inferior fertility or marginal land, but because we haven't really optimized the practice, and so I don't know what will succeed, but
well, yeah. So
that's key, I think.
Absolutely, it's closing the yield gap. So this is what could be produced theoretically on those lands, and the assumptions that go into that, what could be produced, are rich because they either presuppose a lot of nitrogen fertilizer or not very much nitrogen fertilizer, and things like irrigation or not irrigation,
or drip irrigation versus
precisely,
this aerial spraying.
But I guess, I mean, from our perspective at the Land Institute, we really feel like the type of progress that can be made in what we're calling ecological intensification is, we have much more to offer than what's under the hood of some of the folks working in more industrial agricultural systems, where the ecology is pretty compromised. In fact, another comment I had about the second film at the Fork was, you know, I mean, it was one topic, and it was brilliant to talk about animals, but it was as though there wasn't a similar magnitude of a crisis in the plant-based foods part of the world. You know, the solution was to eat more plants and and that would take a lot of pressure off this need to treat animals this way and raise them in these industrial settings. But the fact that our agriculture growing most of our grains, most of our agricultural lands are treated as horrifically, ecologically speaking, as those chickens were being treated in that confinement egg production system. And what that looks like is a plowed, denuded landscape as far as the eye can see that we have grown accustomed to seeing year after year and accepting it just as a natural part of where we live, when in reality, that ecosystem is profoundly compromised. And when folks like Foley write articles on how we're going to need ecological intensification to feed the world by 2050, we're going, where are you going to find that ecological intensification? How are you going to get these processes of stopping nitrogen from leaking out of the bottom of the system, or building soil organic matter, or having soil microbes that do all sorts of neat things to maintain productivity? How are you going to get it to do that with the current systems that we have? And so just as a side note in terms of what's going on right here in Salina, there is a lot of excitement about a natural systems agriculture being able to bring us closer to a more functional ecosystem that has promise in the long run compared to the input intensive approach that even the film was kind of acknowledging is better, and maybe it is better than the animal side, but all is not well in the plant world too. But, yeah.
I really appreciated the opportunity that the Art Center gave in presenting these two films and for the discussion and everything. I've been involved in one way or another in gardening or agriculture, environmental protection kinds of things for quite a long time. And there's some things that kind of struck me about, especially the second film today. There was a contrast between the guys who are justifying their industrial agriculture and that mindset,
Yes.
and those who were more emotional about their animals. And you expect that in young people, but then there was the beef farmer who was saying that as he grew older, and he wasn't an old guy, but as he grew more mature, I guess, the idea of treatment of his animals became more and more important to him as organisms. And like you're talking about cropland, people don't think about that soil as being an organism. And sometimes when I've gone out in the fields as part of my work, and I would see there's not a weed, there's not a grasshopper. I dig a hole, there's no worms, there's nothing in there. It's dead. And so that was really troublesome to me to see that. But what made me respect the one fellow who decided to change the way he was doing things. To me, I see that there's a web of things that we can do to change things and try to prevent the inevitable by our own actions. For instance, providing contraception. We're not talking about zero population growth anymore like we did 40 years ago, and how important that is. Or, you think Soylent Green, we're eating people now. That's one way to get rid of the overpopulation. Another way is to send them to war, or to not provide health care and let them die. Or poison them and they'll get cancer, and we don't have money to treat that either. So it made me examine my own attitudes and thinking, well, I need to be more serious about how I behave in the world. Maybe I should be willing to pay twice as much for that meat that's sustainably grown than I have been. But one thing that kind of dissuaded some farmers from growing things more sustainably was USDA Farm Bill rules. So there was disincentives to diversify, for instance. And so we have a momentum of doing things the same way, and that's not really good for us. I talk to soybean farmers and say, well, could you grow edamame? Or could you grow food-grade Milo? Or, different things like this, and it's like a realm that they never considered. I'd like to see more of that.
Well,
great for the Land Institute, too.
I kind of share with both Bill and Tim and Sarah about the Ford film. What I really appreciated about that film was that he was very emotionally deep. You got people's reasons for it. And you're talking about the farmer change as one example, but on any variety of levels, wide intellectual breadth and coverage, but really deep emotional tie. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, and I was going to ask that question about Mr. Foley, and this thing, is there a mechanism? Where is there a mechanism? I think, Tim, you're asking the same question. How do you make that happen on the ground? There's so much to be said, but what we need is a really benevolent dictator, different than the one we have now. Benevolence being the primary criteria. But for example, you could organize teams and you could go into different blocks in Salina and say, ma'am, at 2 o'clock, we're going to be here, and sir, right after supper, we're going to be here, we're going to strap you in your chair. We're going to show you this film after 4. And then you can join with us. We'll free you up after that. Then you have to sit in the chair. We'll be here while they're done to make sure you don't move. But to be serious about it, how do you get a consciousness of the seriousness of the situation in a population who's mostly concerned, and like me, where the next bit of protein is coming from?
Yeah, they're worried about the next football game.
Yeah.
We've got so many distractions. Another good video on the waste situation that I recommend is called Dive. And it's dumpster divers in LA.
Yeah.
And you talked about we don't throw away much meat. This young couple who had 2 young children, I don't know if I can't remember if they had jobs or not, but they dumpster dived fairly professionally. And they decided to get a freezer, a fairly small chest-type freezer. Within a week, they filled that with a year's worth of food for their family. From dumpster diving.
Yeah,
they had a whole community of divers, and they went to corporations and said, "Can we do this?" No. So they went to the local store manager and said, "Can we do this?" And he said, "Yes," because they gave a lot of it to, food bank and homeless and things like that. They also made their own barbecue. A whole dozen of eggs, unbroken. That's remarkable.
No, I having taught at a kind of a progressive college in Arizona, we did a trip every summer, kind of like the movie, visiting all of these different farming operations from California to the Land Institute. And they about in 1999 or so, the dumpster diving ethos set in at the college. And whenever we'd pull into a town, they'd be in the dumpster, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, and it wasn't always okay. It wasn't always legal. I wasn't sure, but it is amazing what they would pull out. I mean, they lived off dumpster diving, these students did, for, years, actually.
And they get the store's formula.
Yeah, when stuff.
They throw this stuff out.
Yep.
And so they're a plan ahead organization.
Then you let that secret out, everybody's going to know about it. The dumpsters will be clean.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think, just going back to the whole meat thing, I think there's like an attitude problem where people, I'm a vegetarian and I cook vegetarian meals and my husband eats them, and people are always like, well, so do you cook separate dinners for your husband? I'm like, no, like he eats what I eat. And they're like, well, it's not a meal without the meat. And it's like, I think people really treat meat like as a necessity.
Right.
Like you're not gonna, like most people aren't gonna die if they don't eat meat. And they don't treat it like another food group. They treat it like
Right.
You know, like they don't treat it how they treat vegetables or fruit or
Right,
grains.
right.
It's like we don't need meat as much as we act like we need meat.
Mhm.
And I think like unless you can get that like it's not manly to not eat a lot of meat. Like it's I don't know, it's like a very cultural thing we have where we just need to consume meat like at this really extreme level. And I don't know how things are gonna change if people don't like have an attitude change.
Mhm.
We don't, I mean, I've been living without meat for nearly 10 years.
Sure.
And I'm still here. Like it's not.
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
fine,
That's
but I just don't know how you get that through to people. Like.
You know, people have health crises. I've seen that shift people fairly dramatically. But, you know, I think watching a movie like this could have an effect with some people. It's tough, though. It's very hard. I guess, I think it was, here's one of the parallels between the two movies is I was likening the facilitation of someone dying in Soylent Green with the flowers and the music and all of that as kind of the high-end humane treatment of animals, a very, very personal touch, as opposed to the scooping out in the and just throwing them in the back. That's more the industrial model, right, of death in Soylent Green, if I dare draw this. And I started to think, I don't really believe the trophic, that Soylent Green, that enough people were dying to be able to feed people that much Soylent Green, okay, for one thing. Just, I hate to pick on this, but there is like a 1 to 10 ratio probably of how much Soylent Green you can get out of the number of people. And while it was just 1 day a week, I still think it was probably, and the cost of producing Soylent Green with the high-end human care, okay? One body at a time going through that whole thing? I don't think so. I mean, the scoop is what's gonna feed the masses at the cost because it costs nothing, right? Pretty much it was being produced for the masses. But on a more serious note, the ratio, if you will, or the degree to which meat production was humane was correlated with people, with humanity being with those animals, right? I mean, the more it took people raising and scratching and nurturing and helping with birthing and watering and putting them out to pasture, it actually took a high level of integration of people to produce humane meat, not surprisingly, right? And so the degree to which we trade off the next thing was where we actually still use people, but in an industrialized assembly mode, where you might hire illegal or legal immigrants into a feedlot in Garden City, Kansas, and every human there is replaceable with another human because their jobs are defined and they're intended to be replaceable, but it's something that fossil fuels still can't do. So we use humans in an industrial system to get the work done. But the ultimate goal, of course, is using fossil fuels directly to get all the work done, which is what was going on with that chicken egg operation. I mean, it was remarkable how few people were working in that system, highly automated. You just stick this animal in the cage, and then eggs come out, and the water, the manure, and this is where the cheap food, the inhumane food, if you will, comes from. But the cost of trying to produce, when the guy said $9 a dozen for his eggs, and that's still with a fair amount of fossil fuel subsidy, I would suspect, because it's happening everywhere. Everything we do is subsidized by fossil fuels to some extent in agriculture. It does raise the challenge of how we can back out of this high carbon cul-de-sac we're in with climate change and a dependence on fossil fuels if we really are going to be able to pull off a low carbon existence in agriculture. It's more challenging than we think. We are so deeply embedded. just the distribution of food and the distribution of inputs is in and of itself huge. But even on the farm, on an organic farm, we use fossil fuels to address almost every ecological limiting factor. It may not seem like it, but if one way or another, it's integrated into the production system. And I'd love to talk to people more about that if you're interested. But it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. But
A couple things. One was, again, I thought that the second film was wonderful to show the diversity that it was trying not to be just one-sided. And I have no idea how the more ethical treatment and the more less industrialized treatment is how that kind of thinking is going to evolve. That is, it's really going to, I'm sure that organic farming is a bigger percentage of the total food production in the United States than it was a decade ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, maybe 2%.
But in that film, there was, what surprised me was you had these very low technology approaches, and then there was one version of that egg lay where they were showing that, yes, you have the cages and the crowding and whatnot, and then this other version, which was very technological, very low labor input, but it was taking the lives of those hens into account, and I thought that was an example of of something that looked more positive, a combination of technology and concern for the humane treatment of the livestock. And the only other on this whole idea of inputs, the only thing that I thought was interesting was a program I saw recently about Norway, about how 100% of the electricity is either renewable or they have all kinds of hydroelectric reserves because of the nature of where they are, and so it just struck me that why can't a country that doesn't rely, and yet they're a big producer of oil and gas at the same time, but they're exporting it. They're not using it for their own economy. And what struck me when I was watching is I says, well, why can't they use all that electricity to, if one of the limiting factors in agriculture is nitrogen fixation, why can't renewable energy be used to fix nitrogen and overcome that limit? Not all limits, but that was, and whether with this big push, now all this, the photovoltaics getting so inexpensive, will that be a new source of energy to replace the fossil fuels, I guess?
Well, I think we're nearing the end here, maybe, of the discussion. I'm sensing, I don't know, the lights just went on and off, but
I'm on that tread bike.
Generally speaking, the infrastructure of Norway was still built on fossil fuels, and it might be running kind of its current account off a lot of renewables with a lot of financial input from the sale of fossil fuels, as you point out. But most folks that look at the gap between renewables and our fossil fuel economy are still in the ballpark of we need to reduce by 75 to 90% of the total energy we need to really actually synchronize. And that is very depressing to some and optimistic to others, but it's still a huge leap from where we are. The number, I did need to convey the number that I told all students always. If you go away from this discussion with any one statistic, it's that 1 gallon of gas has 100 hours of human labor embodied in it. 1 gallon of gas is 100, and if you don't believe that, try to move a 4,000-pound vehicle 20 miles by yourself without turning it on. Okay, just you. It will take you 100 hours at least, and there's many other examples of that, but that shows why we have gone with hiring that $2.30 for those 100 hours versus if you're paying $10 an hour, that's $1,000. I mean, it really is that order of magnitude in terms of energy disparity, and that explains why growing corn in Iowa, farmers, you know, we stopped on the side of the road. I finally got the picture of the Kansas farmer feeding 155 people, including you. And I said, well, yes, that Kansas farmer and about 400 fossil fuel slaves that are working for that Kansas farmer, because 99.96% of the energy used to grow the grain comes from fossil fuels. Back when this country was founded, it was 0% came from fossil fuels. And now it's almost 100%. The farmer is simply out working the fossil fuels in the tractor, in the nitrogen fertilizer, in the herbicides, in the harvester, in all of the ways. And that's where we've come. So it's, again, I get excited about this topic, but we're in it quite deep. And even the feed race to feed some of these more humanely produced animals is very much embedded. Organic agriculture is very much embedded in it. Because organic agriculture dumpster dives for nutrients, uses what happens with the feedlot manure outside of Garden City, Kansas. It's spread on land in western Kansas near Scott City. There are organic Mennonite farmers growing wheat that goes to Heartland Mills, and it is feedlot manure that is providing the nutrients to raise that organic wheat. Where did the nitrogen come from? It came from the grain that was grown to feed the livestock. You see what I'm saying? So in this way, organic agriculture is as dependent on nitrogen fertilizer as conventional. In this instance, it's not always the case, but anyway.
Can I just,
yeah.
Were you going to say something, sir?
I was going to say a little bit about globally how when countries become more get richer, they start eating more meat, and that Iowa farmer was sending all that pork to Japan, for instance. But you know, here we're talking about cutting back our meat consumption by 40% or something, and
we're down to 40%.
We're down to 40%. Yeah, and I also thought, you know, something that April said about making these choices, that even the guy that made the movie was not convinced. I mean, he could just as easily look at this stuff and put it out of his mind and, you know, order an extra side of bacon at breakfast.
What is that, like, I don't get where that comes from, because, like, I have dogs at home, and I love those dogs. I mean, I love animals, so I don't want to pay to have them tortured for my personal benefit. Like, I just wonder where that disconnect comes from. Like, why do people not care that animals are being tortured?
Because they don't have cows and pigs in their homes. I mean,
but they still have feelings.
I mean, the way that empathy was worded in all those operations, and it's that relation. They're not looking them in the eye every day the way you are looking.
Right, but you don't have to have a pet cow to know that they feel things and they have feelings and they feel pain and they feel torture. Like, everyone knows that. Like, it's not.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
They don't.
Unfortunately. But like, why? So do people really think that dogs feel things but cows don't? Like,
There are people that
I don't think about it.
Yeah, they don't think about it.
I know. That's
but
just
you're
like an
living with
ignorance.
them in a way that promotes this empathy with the animal that you're not with what you eat.
I guess I feel like people should just know
I know.
that, like, a cow can be happy or a cow can be depressed. Like,
Why don't we eat dogs and horses? Why is it,
Right.
you know, we're all pissed off at the Chinese because they eat dogs.
right, there's no difference. I mean, I don't.
Well, you know, it's just an emotional approach to things, and we divorced emotions from pig. You know, my wife was in 4-H, and she raised a cow to be killed. You know, she loved the thing. She loves cows today. She loves the smell of them.
But I don't know how you love something
That's
like
why I
that.
attracted her.
Right. Well, it seems to me that, I think we were really touching on what I thought was a connection between the two films is human empathy and animal human empathy. I mean, fellow sentient being empathy. Because when the thing that runs through my head in Soylent Green is Heston climbing up over those steps full of people laying there and stepping on some of them and how that gets divorced in this mass civilization. And then, as I said, the really great depth of emotional understanding and how humans came to understand more about their animals being raised. We need to have them watch that film.
Yeah.
So I think a solution to how we do this, other than the benevolent dictator solution, is to have people connecting with one another and beginning to understand where they are. We talked at the Unitarian Fellowship today about race and class. How do we can't bridge those very easily in Salina, Kansas. But if we can have people talking to each other at a feeling level, which is no easy task, then we may begin to get the kind of conversation we need to facilitate better food production, reasonable food production, etc.
I think too, as a nation, we grew up and we are always looking for the bargains. That we just have that mindset of buying things the cheapest that's out there, and it's hard to change that, but we definitely need a paradigm shift. And that's one reason why we waste so much food is among, I think it's most of the nations in the world, we spend the least amount of money on our food.
Right, right.
We just need some paradigms to rub together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, when you look at that last, I guess it was the California operation, where you really saw how hard it was emotionally. And I was just thinking, those people should be paid a lot of money for that. The way an emergency room doctor worked. That was hard work. And things were, people were paid what their services were worth. That would adjust the market a little bit.
Well, we have a surprising new solution to this whole problem, actually. So,
Thank you. That's why we came.
and it's.
This is a good segue to this next topic.
I have tentatively diagnosed myself with this tick allergy that you might have read about it, where you're allergic to red meat. You're allergic to mammals. It's the alpha-gal tick-borne allergy. Who's heard of this? Okay, yeah. So it's been in the news quite a bit lately, actually. My sister's in Minnesota, and she was sending me multiple. It's been in the news at NPR and everything there. I discovered it because I had a severe reaction to eating a steak, head to toe hives, respiration. I mean, there's no question that allergy exists, and I've had it now multiple times. So I'm not eating it. It's by mammals. So pork, venison, beef, bison, chicken, and fish are not in the category as these mammals. But we have been joking about how this is a surprising thing that's happening. It is spreading substantially, and there's thousands of people who are becoming allergic. I'm like, John Foley's gonna love this. We just need to breed these ticks, drop them on major urban areas, and there's no choice. It becomes pretty obvious.
But is that,
That's right.
is that evolution? Is that like they know that we need to eat?
I wouldn't go so that far. I mean, the idea that somehow ticks are trying to control our meat consumption,
Right.
It's hard to see where the selection is happening there, but it is intriguing to realize that this allergy seems to be taking off, and it is quite intriguing. So stay tuned. My doctor, by the way, does not believe I have it. I have an official diagnosis the end of July, but I'm 99% sure it's real.
Well, we have the technology. We don't need to carpet bomb these ticks. We can just put drones.
That's right.
Place them,
In the mall food court, here they come.
Good point, Marty.
But the point that Sarah brought up is haunting in that humans have never had access to the kind of meat that we have in this society. And therefore, it seems almost insatiable that we've gone from eating, what she was describing is there's many, many studies that show as societies attain greater discretionary income, they buy more meat. They just do. It's happening in China in a huge way right now. It's sucking the grain markets out of the entire world. And India has certain religious hurdles, but apparently India also is starting to pick up on its meat consumption as discretionary income increases there as well. And yet it doesn't seem to plateau. And I call this kind of thing, using an Paul Ehrlich term, an evolutionary hangover, in that you would never have this problem, and it was always beneficial to eat more meat, but that because for all of our evolutionary existence until the latest 50 years, this was just not a possibility. And so it's very intriguing that the statistic that was mentioned about Foley saying we need to double food production by 2050 when there's only 2 more billion people being added. So what's up with the math there? But what's underneath those numbers is anticipating this phenomenon I'm talking about. Greater discretionary income as the economies grow, and greater demand for animal products requiring more food production. That's what's under the hood. And there's a bunch of us who have been very adamant to not agree to that statement that we need to double food production by 2050. That's like giving in. We need to actually figure out how we can avoid having to double food production. People are not eating the meat yet, but we need to lead by example before we start suggesting, as we were doing with fossil fuels, that other people curb their fossil fuel addiction, or other people could curb their meat consumption before we do.
I've read many times about this increasing consumption of meat, but also I think the increase in food security is equally about malnutrition. That it's not. I probably eat 50% more calories that I need to sustain myself. But I think that billion people in the world that are malnourished, they're not looking to eat meat. They're looking to eat instead of 100 grams of rice to be able to get 200 or 300 grams of rice a day. And so I think that
but it's not a doubling. It's not a doubling. This is the thing. You're absolutely right. And some of that increase is addressing malnutrition. A huge percentage of it is this meat anticipation, is a more animal product-based diet in a more increasing wealthy world. Because to deal with 1 billion malnourished people, indeed, we could do it with almost raising no more food by distribution alone. I'm sure we could, but it's...
There's another film, Tim, that deals with vegetarianism just from a health perspective, no emotional, save the animals or any of that stuff. It's done by 2 doctors. They did separate studies unknowingly. One was in China, and I can't remember what other topic the other one was on. It's called Forks Over Knives.
Yeah, we saw that at the UU.
What's it called again?
Forks Over Knives.
Oh, yeah.
And that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And I've seen interviews with those 2 doctors, medical doctors, by the way, both vegetarians, and tell why. And I don't eat much meat. But boy, it's just really hard. I'm like the guy in the movie. It's really hard to think about giving it up totally.
Well, and I know people always say, like, well, meat tastes so good, but, like, I'm sure heroin feels really good. It's like, we don't do it. There are a lot of things that taste good or feel good, but we don't do them because we shouldn't. Or because they're bad for us. But people don't think about meat like that.
likening meat consumption to heroin. But
I'm interested in the ethical treatment for growing grains that you can brew with. We need to show real compassion toward that.
well, so are there any other concluding thoughts or questions or testimonials that are not yet? Beans, they're what's for dinner.
Who's home to prepare it?
All right.
When I was preparing for this, I saw that there was a new movie that was called Food Evolution. It came out, I guess, in 2016, and they have a website called foodevolutionmovie.com, and it's all about GMOs and what the benefits and what the negative, and it's just a matter of having an organization that wants to screen it to go to that. Could there be a continuing discussion?
Yeah, that would be great. That would be a great, I'd be up for that.
Yes.
Yeah. Hear that?
Anything else?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.